You want to talk about major winners in CSGO? Boomeo's got Shocks, they've got Fallen, Device has got some content forthcoming. These guys are all there creating video guides for you on strats, how to play the game. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, forget CSGO though, what about 1.6? You know, like some teams, I guess you probably had nothing. Well, actually, Boomeo's got Complexity, who was the last North American organization to win a major in 1.6. So a lot of people may be confused by how we had and defined majors in CS 1.6 because there wasn't Valve involvement and Valve putting on tournaments in the way that they are in CSGO. The majors as we have them in CSGO, which are purely the Valve tournaments, exist very separately, and we know they're majors because Valve terms them as such, and so there's a very simple kind of consensus as to which tournaments to call majors. But in Counter-Strike 1.6, there wasn't much confusion, actually. While it's true, Valve wasn't involved, so they were unofficial majors. Technically, one of the majors was, in some sense, Valve kind of official, was Valve recognized, which was actually arguably the first one, CPL Winter 2001. I mean, Heaton actually made a joke in an interview about the fact that as a result, he's still technically the reigning world champion of 1.6, which he is in that respect. But they were unofficial majors, which there was a pretty strong community consensus on, you know, roughly which ones these were. I mean, generally, you're looking at the North American CPL seasonal events, ESWC, the Esports World Cup in France most often, WCG, which was around the world and was a national competition, an international competition, but featuring national teams, and then IEM, Intel Extreme Masters, when it came along in the latter half of CS 1.6, kind of took over from CPL and was eventually, you know, we're talking about the finals of that, the Season 2 finals, the global finals, the World Championship. It was renamed a bunch of different times. Now, generally, my criteria is a little bit more sophisticated than what we actually consciously had decided when we called these tournaments the majors. Realistically, we just called tournaments majors back in 1.6. Because for a start off, these tournaments that we're talking about had the most prize money. Secondly, they had a history of being around a long time. Thirdly, because everyone in the community kind of understood they were majors, the best teams all wanted to go there, and those were the tournaments that really were do or die. It didn't matter so much if you lost the smaller tournament, they might have had the same teams if you didn't do as well at the majors. So there were a lot of the same qualities to what we have in the CSGO majors. But my criteria, to lay it out even more specifically for how I determined which the majors were, and therefore was able to filter out the tournaments which look like majors but maybe weren't, is first and foremost, the number one quality I go with is prestige. It should be a tournament that is understood and recognized by the majority of people as a world championship type tournament, one of the biggest events of the year. And it also, to have that prestige and have that history associated with it and that level of respect for winning it, so it's not just a one-off flash in the pan, it has to run for multiple years. Like, that's a rule I instituted in general, because there were tournaments that came along, WEG Masters, the WSVG finals in New York in 2006. We had masses of prize money, sometimes more than the other majors, but they were only one-offs, and they hadn't had a chance to establish themselves and build a legacy and a proper history and get people on board that this is one of the biggest tournaments that you have to win and practice for and prepare for and will define your career. So they didn't quite meet up on the prestige element. Then you got to add in, the tournament's got to have global competition. And what I mean by that is, it's got to, in theory, be possible for pretty much anyone to go to the tournament or qualify for the tournament. So in the early days of tournaments like CPL, if you just had the money to attend the event, you could go there. So you needed sponsorship, sure, but that doesn't mean that in theory anyone was excluded. Like, if you really were the best team in the world and you'd come from Singapore and you could get the sponsorship or win a qualifier that someone was holding there, you could go to the tournament, and this happened. So in theory, it was truly the best competition. Likewise, in later years, for things like World Cyber Games, etc., ESWC, some of these tournaments had regional qualifiers. And if you could win those qualifiers, you got to go to the main tournament. The problem is, there's tournaments that were very stacked. Obviously, in Counter-Strike history in both versions, Europe's generally been the best region, and by quite a large margin. So yes, there's tournaments in Europe that were very stacked. There were DreamHack Winters, etc., that looked really sick towards the end of the game. But despite being stacked, they didn't meet a lot of the other competition criteria, and sometimes they didn't always have the global competition element to it. Like, for example, there was an IEM tournament, which I'll get into later, which you couldn't qualify for unless you were from Europe. So immediately that kind of eliminates it as a major to me, despite the fact that it was a very stacked tournament. Now, finally, as I mentioned, it should have among the biggest prize money in the scene. It should kind of reward being some of the biggest tournaments and the most important in your career with what you actually win for doing so. So, with that criteria in mind, Another reason, which isn't really necessarily set in the same way, it kind of ties into the prestige angle, but is one of the reasons why you could tell which the majors were, is that there was kind of a consensus on them. Like, they meant the most to the fans, they meant the most to the players. Everyone kind of understood, even the tournament organizers knew that these were the biggest tournaments. There was kind of a general sense of that, which is why in CSGO, we have the same consensus, but we just have the Valve majors, so we don't need to figure out which ones are and aren't majors. So by my count, after writing them all down, I have there being 31 different majors in CS 1.6 over a 12-year span, starting in 2001 at the very end and going through to early 2012. So in 2001, there was only one major. It was the first tournament that really fit all that criteria and was a true major, and it was CPL Winter. And it was a tournament that had $50,000 for first place, which is a massive jump up in prize money. It was a tournament where all the top teams tried to go. It had an extremely stacked field. And in fact, it was one of the first events where Europe truly dominated a massive international competition, because we hadn't had many international competitions. Europe ended up with something like 8 out of the top 12 spots. And like some, a whole bunch of the top spots. Basically, X3 was one of the few teams from NA that went really high in the tournament. Beyond that, you had, in 2002, you had CPL Summer events. So you had the next regional NA event within there, which was the one that SK Gaming famously won for their first time with the Heaton and Potty combo in their lineup. They'd been in NIP that had won the tournament before. Again, massive tournament. Then that year we had World Cyber Games, the second edition of the World Cyber Games. And I'll get into why the first one didn't count. The second one met all the criteria, was a very good tournament. It actually had some very bizarre results in the end. The strongest teams didn't win the tournament. In fact, the tournament was won by a Russian team called M19, and second place was a team from Canada who'd never really done anything otherwise, called Nerve. So CPL Winter, the other CPL regional event, a year later from the first major, was the last major of 2002. We've got the 4 majors out the way there. Right, 2003, one of the key kind of developments in the scene is that ESWC arrives, and even though initially for the first event in theory you don't have the prestige factor, etc., that's another element. Okay, if a tournament has all the criteria for the first tournament, it does have global competition, a lot of prize money, is a big tournament, and then all the future years are considered major, I kind of tend to retroactively count that first event because it kind of did have prestige, but it kind of retroactively got it applied. So it's a little bit of wiggle room, but this was a big tournament and all the big teams did try to go to it in general. And it was the first year of it, but it went on to become eventually, a couple of years later, the main major. But at the time, it was still subservient to CPL Summer and CPL Winter, which were the truly big ones that you really wanted to win. World Cyber Games, just for the prestige, the fact it was sometimes being Korea, and you have the gold medal and the national element, that could add its own prestige. But really, there's a reason why Heaton and Potty won the CPLs more than the other tournaments, and those really were the ones that counted the most. So we had ESWC start in 2003, and then we had CPL Summer again, we had WCG again, we had CPL Winter again. Come along to 2004, okay, we have ESWC again, we have CPL Summer again, we have CPL Winter. No, I didn't put in 2004 WCG, which I'll get to in the section on the ones that I discount. 2005, we go down to the least majors we've had since the first year, which we go down only 2 majors. We only had ESWC and CPL Winter. No CPL Summer, no World Cyber Games, as I'll get to. 2006 comes along, one of the most competitive years of all time. I would argue the true best year of Counter-Strike in many senses. And 2006 was a year where you had 4 majors. You had ESWC, you had WSVG ISC, which was a renamed version of CPL Summer. You had WCG, and you had CPL Winter. 2007, we dropped back again to 2. We had ESWC and we had WCG because the CPL died out that year and wasn't paying any prize money, so people weren't attending the events anymore. And ESWC very much had taken over the year before as the main major. 2008 comes along. You have IEM2 finals. No, I didn't put IEM1, which we'll talk about later. We had ESWC and we had WCG, another competitive year there. 2009, unfortunately, ESWC had died out after 2008. They'd gone bankrupt, so we only had 2 majors in this area. Famously, that's why Fnatic could only win 1 and were just denied the other one by the polls. And this is a very dominant era for them, so it stopped them winning ESWC. So we had IEM3 Global, which was when Fnatic first made their rise as the 2009 lineup and dominated. And then we had WCG, which is the one that, again, the polls took away from Fnatic. 2010, we had the IEM4 World Championship. Crucially, when I say IEM2 finals, IM3 Global Finals, IM4 World Championship. It's all the same tournament. They just kept rebranding the name of the tournament for some reason. So the IM4, this one was actually technically the Global Finals as well. I've got ahead of myself on that one. But some places called it the World Championship. We had ESWC, because ESWC returned in 2010 with different ownership, but some of the same people involved. World Cyber Games was still around. We had that. 2011 comes along. We have 3 majors. We had IM5 World Championship, which is won by Navi. They'd won the 3 from 2010 as well. We had ESWC, which was actually won by SK Gaming when they had a very good lineup with Dolpan and Get Right in Forest. We had the World Cyber Games, which was won by the Poles in narrow fashion over SK Gaming. Now, the last major in 1.6 was in March of 2012, and it was the IEM6 World Championships, which was also won by the Poles. They won the last 2 majors on the way out, but with Pasha in their lineup, whereas the other majors they'd won would be when they had Luke in the lineup with the Golden 5. So the reason why I discluded some of them is because some of them are kind of questionable cases. Now, there are a couple that I do count as majors that I've just mentioned in that list that are questionable in their own right, but I came down one way where other people went another way. So first and foremost, there were 2 tournaments that in a very, very rough sense, you could at least have thrown into the conversation as majors before the first major. The first major was in December of 2001, CPL Winter. But before that, CPL had two big North American tournaments before then. In 2000, in December, they had the Babbage's CPL, one of the first tournaments to feature Counter-Strike. It wasn't necessarily like an official game in the same way, because actually Quake was the big game at the time still at the CPL. And yeah, it had some international teams, like, for example, Potty won the tournament playing in E9, which was essentially NIP with a different branding. But it didn't have, like, first of all, it had very limited prize money compared to any of these other majors I'm listing. Not that much money to win. It didn't have much international flavor. It just had 1 or 2 foreign teams. It didn't have tons of teams attending. There wasn't the same level of sponsorship in the scene. CS as an esport wasn't as big at the time. Hadn't fully taken over from Quake yet. So really, it doesn't fit a lot of the other criteria. And even though that is technically the same tournament as CPL Winter a few years later, it wasn't branded the same way. It wasn't an official tournament in the same way. So I don't think it gets to get the retroactive kind of prestige added to it. Then you add in, there was the Speakeasy CPL, which was the next regional one in 2001, partway through the year. Now, not only did this not have as much international flavour as well, in fact, NIP chose not to attend and they broke up. It had, again, limited prize money. It only had a few teams except for NA teams. So again, that doesn't really count. Now, you get to 2001, and there was a World Cyber Games event that year. So why isn't this tournament counted as a major? Because all the other World Cyber Games are counted as a major. Right, well, there's a problem, which is it was actually held the exact same time period as CPL Winter, the first major. CPL Winter had more prize money. All the teams in general tried to go to that, and all the teams who qualified and had the prize money did go to that tournament. And the teams that went to the World Cyber Games as a result were the teams that couldn't fly over and go to the NA tournament, or just won a qualifier, or with secondary teams who maybe lost the CPL qualifiers. So as a result, that's why it wasn't that crazy a lineup at the event. It was won by Canada's Legends Never Die, featuring Steel. Obviously not a world-class team, just a good team. Second place was MTW, the Germans. Again, like a good team, certainly, but not an elite level team. The results bore out that it wasn't a truly world-class major level tournament, despite the fact, yeah, you did win a gold medal for winning it. I mean, as a funny side detail that I've mentioned in the past, there is an alternate universe in which this might have been a major and the whole scene might have been split, and it might have taken longer to actually bring together the EU and NA elite teams for a proper battle, because before this tournament was held, the European teams used to compete in charges only, whereas NA competed in max rounds as their rule set. So at the time, Europe didn't want to switch over because they thought, and I still to this day contend, it's the superior format actually. So they were talking to World Cyber Games and telling them, listen, even though you've got a little bit less prize money, for example, it's like 40k for first place for World Cyber Games, 50k for CPL Winter, even though you've got a bit less prize money, if you just make the rule set what we like, the one that we like in Europe, we'll come to your tournament and the NA guys can go to their tournament. So there could have been a huge split like that. But do you know what happened in 2001 that meant that this could no longer be the case? Well, there's something happened on the 11th of September, a terrorist attack in America, and unfortunately, believe it or not, that played a role in the World Cyber Games thinking we don't want to promote a rule set which only counts the rounds that terrorist players win. So as a result, that's purely the reason why they went to max rounds as well. And therefore, there was no reason for anyone at this point to attend World Cyber Games over CPL. So as a result, what could have been a very interesting split and a difference in rules even, and maybe delayed the scenes being unified, actually didn't end up happening because of the terrorist attack in real life. Then you've got another World Cyber Games that I don't count, is the one in 2004. Now, the problem with this one is I do think this is very borderline. I can understand why some people would count it, because here's the thing. It was played in CS Condition 0, which was like a modded version of 1.6. It was basically the 1.6 engine. A lot of it was like 1.6, but there were a few details were a little bit different. Like, for example, grenades were very different in terms of how they did damage to you. But aside from that and the models being different, the maps were fairly the same. It looked almost the same. It was basically the same game. So here's the thing. I can understand people who want to count it as a game, but I still think just because it's not pure 1.6, I personally don't count it. I will say as well, a little bit of that is also on a side element. There's an element that tells me it wasn't as much as well in the fact that 3D at the time wasn't that good a team anymore, but they managed to beat SK Gaming, who was fantastic at the time, and beat them in the semi-finals. And then SK even lost the bronze medal to Maven, the Korean team. So I've always found that to be a little bit bullshit, you know? So that's just a side detail of flavor text, but that's why I kind of discount that one. CPL Summer 2005, even though it was a CPL event in the summer in NA, unfortunately, it had the same problem WCG did, but the other way round. ESWC was going on at the same time. CPL actually chose to directly go head-to-head with ESWC on the same dates, initially announced only a Source tournament, but then put in a 1.6 tournament because Source wasn't popular as it was released, and then had a tournament, but as a result, it was the other way around. This time, CPL were the ones who only got the stragglers and the leftovers. Everyone else went to ESWC. Complexity won ESWC. They were declared world champions. Now, the team that won CPL was very good as well. It was SK Sweden, who went on to win the next CPL that was a proper major, but this is when they'd only just reformed. That's why they actually went to this tournament. They weren't in a position to qualify because some of them had been in NIP beforehand, so they weren't going to be able to go to ESWC in that particular kind of a setup, and so scheduling just meant that this one wasn't actually a major. And also the field was much weaker and kind of bore that out. This is the one where famously you had lineups that were finishing third and fourth that weren't even proper teams really. Then you've got WCG 2005. Now, this one for me definitely isn't a major because it wasn't played in Counter-Strike 1.6 in any context. It was played in CS Source. And even worse, even as a CS Source tournament, they ruined it by letting lots of the regional qualifiers run the qualifier in CS 1.6 and then run the finals of the grand finals of the whole tournament, as in the global tournament in Source. So as a result, a lot of the Source teams that were good at the time didn't even qualify because the 1.6 teams beat them in 1.6 and then went to represent their country in a totally different game, didn't do that well, and this was just kind of a whack tournament, quite frankly. So in that sense, it's obviously not a 1.6 major. Now, in 2006, there was a tournament that in some context, as I referred to before, would have fit the bill as a major if it had continued, which is the WSVG New York Finals. For first place, you got $50,000 and each member of your team got a Rolex watch. So this was huge prize money. It was the grand finals for the WSVG tour that they'd had during that year. And so it had all the qualities, if it had continued in future years, to be a major, but it was only done for that 1 year. And in 2007, WSVG fell apart before they could hold the finals at this particular point. It didn't have CS by the end of it. And so, yeah, unfortunately, it just doesn't really count in that sense. Now, I do count WSVG ISC, which was from the summer of 2006, even though ESWC was right before, and I count that as a major as well, because the thing is, there's a lot of very good teams still at this tournament. In general, teams did still try to go to it. I know Lurpus, for example, thinks it shouldn't be counted because of its proximity to ESWC, and ESWC being the bigger major. So I can understand that, and I do think it is troublesome to have 4 majors in 2006. I can see why you might bump WSVG ISC, but I think because it continues the trend of CPL summers, and it did have a lot of good teams, and in theory, it met all the qualification aspects, it still did have prestige, because to me it was a CPL, even though it was WSVG branded. I think personally, I come down on the side of letting it edge in. Right, the first IEM, Intel Extreme Masters, which was won by the Poles, it was their second major, for me, doesn't count as a major because it had no international flavour. It was only European teams. There wasn't an opportunity for NA teams to qualify. There wasn't an opportunity for Chinese teams to qualify, for Korean teams to qualify. And these regions all had good teams at the time. So that's a problem for me if it wants to be a major. Although, because the Poles won it, many people back then, this is one of the events where the consensus wasn't as clear, people did count it, and especially because all the other years of IEM, the finals were certainly majors. So some people confer major status on it in that sense. Personally, I just come down on the other side on that one and say it isn't because it didn't have the international flavour. Now, World Cyber Games 2011 is one where I do consider it a major. It fits all the criteria to be a major ultimately. I can understand why people think it shouldn't be because it had a very weak field for a World Cyber Games that year. Basically, SK and the Poles were the only good teams there. They were in the finals. Beyond that, you had some all right teams, but a lot of the other elite or semi-elite teams didn't make it. Now, it has to be said, first and foremost, some of that isn't actually the fault of the tournament. Like, for example, Na'Vi could have been there. So the top 3 teams in the world could have been there, but Na'Vi failed the Ukrainian qualifier and then waited too long to ask to get a second spot and try and figure out the funding, so they didn't go to the tournament. And they, at the time, had been in the final of every single major, 5 in a row that they'd had since they'd been formed. So them not being there made it not as good, but that's not the fault of World Cyber Games that Na'Vi lost the qualifier. Then you got to consider, Fnatic could have represented Sweden as the second best team from the region, but due to this whole situation that went on with like something like there was like a Nordic qualifier that you had to go and attend first. They, as a result, didn't want to. I think it was something along those lines. And like they could have also represented, but they chose not to spend the money. So again, there could have been another very good team there. Then finally, MTW, the great Danish team, I think had actually broken up by the finals took place, but more importantly, there was no Danish qualifier that year. The Danish qualifiers had already had some issues the year before, but they certainly, as they had the year before, could have gotten some sponsorship and could have attended anyway, but again, broke up, chose not to, and as a result, Denmark didn't have someone representing them, and Denmark was one of the better nations towards the end of 1.6. So a lot of those factors, to me, aren't the tournament's fault, quite frankly, and there's a world in which you don't have to change much, and there would have been 3 or 4 much better teams there, and there'd be no problem for anyone in terms of the team list. Now, you can see there why I did and didn't include some of those majors. I will say that CSGO, until the official Valve majors, didn't have any majors. We didn't actually have any consensus in the scene on them being majors. In theory, a lot of them met some criteria, like had decent prize money. You could qualify from Europe and qualify from NA for ESEAs, for example. You had the EMS tournaments, but they were only in Europe and had very stacked lineups. The problem is it didn't fit all the criteria. It wasn't until that first one in DreamHack Winter 2013 that you had the proper prize money, the fully international flavor to it. Like, obviously, it continued and got a legacy and built up the prestige element. So 1.6 had its majors. There is a little bit of wiggle room and a little bit of kind of penciling in and crossing out on a couple of them. But in general, we know which the big ones are, which the majors were. That's why we count them for people's greatness. We know which players won the most, the Poles, Na'Vi. We know some of the players who conspicuously didn't win that many, actually. For example, a lot of the great Swedish players of the latter day, like Forrest, like Robban, like Valle. But obviously, we did have some fantastic Swedes like Heaton and Potty who won a whole bunch in the early days.
Hello, I'm male feminist Anders Bloom, and because all lives matter here at Thorin's channel, I give you a big welcome.